The thing sank its teeth into Corporal Dario Reyes at 3:47 on a Tuesday, which was, as he would later tell anyone who would listen, a pretty rude way to start a week. He was 40 meters from the crash site, picking his way through the scrub brush with a flashlight he'd borrowed from Sergeant Vasquez, when something dropped from the dark out of a sky still scattered with the light trails of whatever had fallen. The bite took him on the left forearm, a crescent of pressure that broke skin before he jerked back and swung the flashlight, and the thing skittered off into the dark, trailing a sound like static electricity given legs. He looked at the wound, 2 rows of punctures, barely bleeding, already going numb. "Oh," he said. Then he kept walking toward the light. This is the part that the hegemony's xenobiological division would later spend 6 months debating in closed session, because by all rights Corporal Dario Reyes should have been dead inside 11 minutes. The venom of a Karath scout creature was, according to every dataset in the hegemony's archive, universally fatal to carbon-based bipedal life. It had been tested on 47 species across 12 star systems. The results were consistent. The venom disrupts cellular respiration at the mitochondrial level, shuts down the autonomic nervous system in sequence, and culminates in complete organ failure. The hegemony had, in fact, selected this world specifically because their scouts reported it inhabited by carbon-based bipedal creatures, of exactly the kind the venom was designed for. What the scouts had not tested for, because it had never occurred to anyone to test for it, was what happened when the carbon-based bipedal creature in question had spent the last 11 years working cattle in high desert altitude, drinking water that came out of the ground tasting of iron and sulfur, eating food laced with compounds that no hegemony nutritionist would have classified as food, and occasionally losing bar fights to men twice his size in ways that left him with a rebuilt left knee, 2 cracked ribs that had healed at a slight angle, and a liver that functioned at roughly 63% of optimal capacity. What the scouts had not accounted for was the fact that Dario Reyes was, in the specific biological sense, a catastrophe that had learned to walk upright. His immune system, hardened by years of doing things to his body that would have hospitalized a more sensible creature, did not recognize the Karath neurotoxin as a threat so much as it recognized it as a competitor. It attacked. The venom, encountering a biological environment that resembled, on a cellular level, a war zone that had been on fire for a decade, mutated, degraded, became inert. Dario Reyes walked through the scrub brush, felt his arm go tingly, shook it out and kept walking. The ship was bigger than it had looked from the ridgeline. It had come down hard, a long gouge in the earth where the landing had gone wrong. The aft section crumpled against a limestone outcropping that had refused to cooperate, steam or gas, or something still venting from a seam along the hull that glowed faintly blue in the dark. The shape of it was nothing like what Dario had been expecting when the radio call went out about something falling near kilometer marker 47 on the old highway. He'd expected a satellite. Some piece of military hardware that came down wrong. This was not a satellite. He stopped at the edge of the gouge and looked at it for a long time. The flashlight beam caught the hull's surface, a material that wasn't quite metal, wasn't quite ceramic, that seemed to absorb some of the light and throw back something subtly different. The venting gas smelled like ozone and something else underneath it that he couldn't name, something almost organic, like the inside of a greenhouse pressed clothes. There were markings on the hull that were not numbers and not letters, and not anything he had a word for. He should have gone back, he knew that. He was a corporal in the Mexican Federal Police, not a soldier, not a scientist, and whatever this was, it was above his pay grade by several astronomical units. He had sent his location back to Vasquez 20 minutes ago. The sergeant would have called it in by now. People would be coming. In the meantime, there was a hatch. It was open, just a few centimeters dark beyond, but open, and from inside there was a sound that stopped him cold, not a mechanical sound, not the groan of a hull settling, but something that was unmistakably biological, Something that sounded, against all reason and in the dark outside a crashed alien spacecraft in the desert at 3:47 on a Tuesday, like something trying to breathe. Dario Reyes was not a brave man. He was clear about this. Bravery implied a calculation, some weighing of risk and reward that resulted in a choice. What Dario had was something his grandmother had called testarudes, which translated roughly as stubbornness, but carried an implication of fundamental unreasonableness, of a refusal to accept that a situation was beyond you simply because all the evidence indicated it was. He wedged his fingers into the hatch and pulled. The interior of the ship was dark and warm and smelled like nothing he had ever smelled before, layers of it, complex and alienating, like walking into a room that had been occupied for years by creatures that breathed different air. His flashlight threw wild shadows off equipment that followed no logic he could parse, panels of something that reacted to his light by shifting color, cables that pulsed with slow light the way veins pulse with slow blood. A central chamber that opened up taller than he expected, ringed with what might have been display screens or windows, or something with no equivalent in any human category. In the center of the floor, in a containment structure that had partially collapsed when the ship came down hard, were the creatures. There were 5 of them, he counted. He stood very still with his flashlight casting long shadows and counted 5 shapes in the broken containment cells, and something in the back of his mind made a note that the cells were designed for containment, for holding things in, which meant someone had put them there. Someone had, at some point, loaded these things onto this ship, the way you load livestock into a trailer, which meant someone was in charge, and whoever was in charge was either elsewhere on the ship or... A sound from above him. He looked up. She was watching him from an elevated platform that ran along the upper curve of the chamber, her silhouette backlit by the slow pulse of lights that still worked up there. Tall, thin in a way that was wrong, too many joints in the wrong places, but humanoid enough that his brain kept trying to slot her into familiar categories and kept failing. She was watching him with what he could only describe as assessment, the same look the livestock inspector gave a herd he was trying to price. He raised the flashlight. She didn't flinch. He said in Spanish, because it was all he had, "Are you hurt?" She said something, not Spanish, not any language, a sound like 2 musical notes played simultaneously with static underneath. "Okay," Dario said, "we'll figure it out." He looked back at the containment cells. One of the creatures, the one nearest him, a thing with too many limbs and eyes that caught the flashlight wrong, that had been still as stone, turned its head and looked at him with the methodical precision of something that was deciding whether he was prey. Dario looked at it. It looked at him. He said very quietly, "Don't." The creature held very still. He never understood afterward why it worked. He had a theory, which was that most predators are making a risk calculation, and the risk calculation requires the prey to behave like prey. The moment prey stops behaving like prey, stops showing fear, stops moving away, stops doing any of the things that confirm the classification, the calculation breaks down and the predator defaults to caution. It's not bravery that stops a predator. It's confusion. Whatever the reason, the creature looked at him and then it looked away. Dario Reyes exhaled very slowly and went to find something he could use to prop the hatch open, because the people coming from town were going to need a way in. The woman on the platform watched him the entire time. Her name was, in the phonetic approximation that Dario eventually settled on, Vale. The language she spoke used tonal distinctions and harmonic layering that the human vocal apparatus couldn't reproduce with any accuracy. But after 2 weeks of the most bizarre crash course in cross-species communication that anyone had ever attempted in a federal police impound hangar outside Hermosillo, they had a functional pidgin that consisted of Spanish words, hand gestures, a set of tonal markers that Dario produced by humming at specific pitches, and a shared vocabulary of approximately 300 concepts. The other woman, the one he hadn't seen at first, the one who had been locked in a separate compartment at the rear of the ship, did not participate in these sessions. She watched through the reinforced transparent panel they'd installed in her door, and the quality of her watching reminded Dario of something he eventually identified. It reminded him of the way a man in a card game watches the player he's planning to cheat. Her name was, as far as he could determine, Sira. She did not hum back. From Vale, across the 2 weeks of sessions in the hangar with government scientists listening through audio equipment, and a xenolinguistics specialist flown in from the capital making frantic notes, Dario learned the following. They had come from a civilization that called itself, in translation, something like the hegemony, a word that carried connotations of order, of correctness, of things arranged the way they were meant to be arranged. The hegemony occupied a significant portion of the local star cluster. They had been aware of Earth for approximately 40 years. They had classified it as they classified all inhabited worlds by biological utility. What species were present, what resources they represented, whether the dominant species constituted a threat. Earth had been classified as low utility, low threat. The carbon-based bipeds were pre-spaceflight, pre-energy weapons, pre-anything the hegemony's metrics counted as relevance. They breathed oxygen in a nitrogen atmosphere. They were soft-skinned and fragile. They had not left their own gravity well in any meaningful numbers. The ship had been a survey vessel. The creatures in the cells were biological samples, a predator species from other catalogued worlds, collected for study, each one with a dossier of capabilities, toxins, kill rates. The Kareth scout creature that had bitten Dario in the dark was one of them. Vale told him all of this with the careful cadence of someone delivering information they considered obvious. She told him the classification. She told him the projected timeline for the next survey phase, which would involve more ships and more thorough assessment of the resource value of the planet's atmosphere, hydrosphere, and mineral content. She told him the projected outcome for the dominant species. Dario sat with this for a long moment. Then he asked, through their pigeon, whether she was telling him this because she thought he needed to know, or because she wanted something. Vale was quiet for a moment. Then she made a gesture that he had come to recognize as something between an acknowledgement and a concession. She wanted something. The monsters were not, strictly speaking, monsters. Dario had spent enough time in the hangar to understand this. They were predators, which was different. Predators are specialists. They are very good at one thing, and that one thing is optimized killing within a specific environmental context. Move them out of their context and the optimization breaks down. The Cyclops-shaped one, he had taken to thinking of it as the eye, because naming things was how he coped, was a visual hunter. It tracked movement. In the hangar's fluorescent light, with no cover and no prey behavior to trigger the hunt, it sat in the corner of its cell and occasionally made a sound like grinding stone. The multi-limbed one, the spider, was tactile. It hunted by vibration, by the specific frequency of a creature trying to move quietly. In the hangar, with the constant low thrum of the ventilation system giving it noise to focus on, it had begun treating the ventilation grate as a companion of some kind. The skeleton-shaped one, which Dario privately called the bone, was a specific category of horror that took him longer to categorize. It was a collector. Its biology was oriented around acquisition. It didn't kill prey so much as it absorbed them, incorporated them. The government scientists were very interested in this one. They spent a lot of time behind the one-way glass looking at it and speaking to each other in lowered voices. The fourth creature, slug-shaped, slow, almost peaceful-looking, turned out to be the most dangerous, which was a lesson Dario felt he should have learned by now. It communicated psychically, not in any mystical sense but electromagnetically, producing fields that disrupted the brain's electrical activity with remarkable precision. It could induce euphoria, terror, somnolence, dissociation. It had no interest in killing. It simply wanted everything in its vicinity to be calm. The fifth creature was Sira. Dario had known for almost a week before he was willing to say it out loud. He said it to Vale first in their pidgin, and Vale's response was a long silence followed by a harmonic chord that he had no clean translation for, but that carried, unmistakably, the weight of something confirmed. Sira was not a prisoner. Sira was not a crew member. Sira was not a passenger in any conventional sense. Sira was the ship's system, the consciousness that ran the vessel, that managed the containment protocols, that calculated the transit calculations and monitored the biological cargo. She was, in the hegemony's taxonomy, an instrument, a category that meant something more than a tool and less than a person, an entity grown into function, shaped to purpose, as foreign to the concept of its own autonomy as a compass is to the concept of picking a direction for itself. But something had happened in the crash. Some protocol had disrupted, and in the 37 hours between the landing and the moment Dario had pulled the hatch open, something that had never been designed into Sira had begun to develop. She had begun to want things. Not the hegemony's catalog of designated functions, not the survey mission parameters, something else. Something that had no name in the hegemony's language because it had no precedent in the hegemony's experience. She was watching through the panel, and she was watching specifically for him, and she was waiting for something that she couldn't have told you in any language she possessed. The trouble came on a Thursday, 16 days after the crash, when the government stopped being patient. Dario had not been naive about the timeline. He understood that a crashed alien spacecraft in a federal police impound hangar could not stay a federal police matter indefinitely. He had watched the quality of the people arriving at the hangar change, from local officials to federal officials to people who arrived without identification and sat in folding chairs and asked very specific questions about the creature's response patterns and the technology in the ship, and whether anyone had managed to access the weapon systems. The night before Thursday, Vale had told him, in their pidgin, that the hegemony would be sending another ship. Survey protocol for a lost vessel involved a recovery mission, and the recovery mission would carry a full assessment team. They would arrive in approximately 90 local days. Their assessment would include the standard evaluation of what the hegemony called, in translation, tidiness. The question of whether a world situation was tidy enough to warrant development, or complicated enough to require clearing. He had asked her in the pidgin what clearing meant. She had been quiet for a long time. Then she had made the gesture he was coming to understand meant, "You already know." Thursday arrived, and so did the people who wanted to move the creatures to a different facility in a different state, and wanted Dario transferred to a different assignment, and wanted the hangar cleared of anyone who had been present since the beginning. The man who told him this was very polite about it, which is the way men are polite when they've already decided and they're just informing you. Dario told the man that he needed 20 minutes to gather his personal items. The man said yes. Dario walked to the hangar, past the 2 soldiers now stationed at the main entrance, and he walked to the cell that contained the psychic slug thing, the 4th creature, and he stood in front of the containment barrier and he talked to it. He wasn't sure why. He wasn't sure it could understand him. He wasn't sure it could even perceive him in any meaningful way. But it had been in a cell for 16 days, and he had been the only person who came to the cells and spoke to what was inside them without a clipboard, without a camera, without the particular kind of focused coldness that meant you were looking at data and not a creature. He said, "I don't know if you can tell what I want. I'm going to assume you can. What I want is very simple. I want you to stay calm. I want you to wait. And I want you, when the time comes, to trust a very unreasonable plan." The creature pulsed once, slow and bioluminescent, deep violet, and then it went still. He walked to Sira's compartment. She was watching through the panel the way she always watched. He pressed his hand flat against the transparent material, which was warm to the touch, and he said in Spanish, because the language was all he had and she had been listening to it for 16 days, and he believed, on a level he couldn't justify to anyone who'd ask him to justify it, that she understood more than she let on. I need you to open every cell. Not yet. When I tell you, can you do that? Sierra looked at him for a long moment. Then she pressed her hand against the other side of the panel. It wasn't technically an answer. He chose to take it as one. The plan, such as it was, had 3 components. The first component was Vale, who had spent 16 days learning that Dario Reyes was the category of creature the hegemony's databases classified as no credible threat, but who had slowly, incrementally, begun to suspect that the classification was wrong. Vale had a way of carrying information that she considered settled, a kind of resolved quality in her harmonics, a stillness in the too many jointed frame, and Dario had noticed, without being able to precisely articulate how he'd noticed, that the resolved quality had been absent for several days. She was reconsidering something. He found her in the secondary bay, and he told her, in their pidgin, what was coming, what the recovery ship would mean, what the assessment team's arrival would result in for a world that had a crashed survey vessel and live biological samples in federal police custody, and no capacity to prevent what happened next. He told her that there was another option, that the option required her cooperation, that the option was, by any standard the hegemony would apply, completely insane. Vale was quiet for a long time. Then she said, in harmonics that he translated slowly and imperfectly, "You are going to try this anyway." "Yes," he said. "Even if I don't cooperate?" "Yes." She made the concession gesture. "Then tell me the plan." The second component was the creatures themselves. The eye hunted movement, the spider hunted vibration, the bone was a collector. The slug thing, he had started thinking of it as the calm, could project electromagnetic fields that disrupted electrical activity. The people in the hangar used radios and equipment that ran on electrical signals through copper wire and circuitry. He explained this to Vale. She translated, in harmonics that made the eye's grinding stone sound shift, and the spider's attention angle toward them, and the bone become very still in a way that might have been listening. The calm pulsed once violet. "Okay," Dario said, "here's what I need you to understand. I'm not asking you to hurt anyone. I'm asking you to be in a different location than the one they've assigned you to. I'm asking you to make that complicated for them. Can you do that without?" He stopped. He looked at the eye, which was tracking him with the methodical attention of a creature that had been doing nothing but existing in a box for 16 days. "Can you do that without killing anyone?" he finished. The eye stopped tracking him and looked at the wall instead. He chose to take it as a yes. The third component was Sierra. The ship system still functioned. The engines were offline, the aft section crumpled against the limestone wasn't getting off the ground in its current condition, but the navigation, communications, and certain operational protocols were intact. Vale had spent 2 weeks quietly in the intervals between sessions, working on the communication array, not broadcasting, just listening, cataloging what she heard. What she heard was 90 days of signal, 90 days of transmissions on the frequencies the hegemony's recovery ship would be monitoring for distress indicators. What she could send back was a signal that would, to any hegemony receiver, appear to be the standard final log notation of a vessel that had gone down hard and not survived. A notation that would mark this world as surveyed, assessed, and found uninhabitable. A notation that would close the file. She could fake the hegemony's own handwriting on the letter and mail it back to them. She needed 4 minutes of uninterrupted access to the communication array. The timing required the com's electromagnetic pulse to suppress all radio communication in the hangar, and its immediate vicinity for exactly that window. It required the eye and the spider and the bone to occupy the attention of the soldiers and the officials, and the people with no identification in whatever way they chose that did not involve killing. It required Dario to be at the communication array with Vale, and Vale to input the sequence, and Sira to have unlocked the ship systems. It was a plan that had a lot of things in it that could go wrong. At 22:13 on a Thursday, the lights in the hangar went out. What followed was, depending on your perspective, either 18 minutes of pure chaos or 18 minutes of the most precisely sequenced biological event. The hegemony's analysts would spend months reconstructing from the incident report. The comm pulsed, and every radio in a 200-meter radius produced static and nothing else. The spider moved through the dark by vibration, and did not, technically, harm anyone, though 3 government officials described the sensation of something touching them in the dark in ways that would feature in their subsequent therapy for some time. The eye moved through the dark by tracking heat signatures, and positioned itself between the main hangar doors and the exits, in a manner that made it clear to the soldiers attempting to leave that this was not, currently, an option available to them. The bone sat in the center of the hangar and collected things: radios, the politely apologetic man's briefcase, 3 clipboards, a folding chair. It was particular about what it chose, and the scientists watching from the dark would note, later, that everything it collected was made of metal and carried trace electrical charge, and speculate at length about why. Dario and Vale were at the communication array. The array had been partially restored by the government scientists, who had been very interested in understanding how it worked and had, in doing so, made it functional. Dario stood in the blue-lit interior of the ship and watched Vale work, and she worked the way she always worked, with a settled, methodical quality that was, he realized, the thing that had made him trust her. Not warmth, not familiarity, competence. The particular dignity of someone who is very good at a thing and does not need to announce it. She input the sequence. Dario heard, from somewhere behind him, the sound of Sira's compartment unsealing. He turned. She was standing at the entrance to the communication bay. In the 18 days since the crash, he had only ever seen her through the panel, a silhouette, a shape, a presence that watched. Now she was in the same space as him for the first time, and she was strange and tall and built along lines that his eye kept sliding off of, and she looked at him with the expression of a creature that has spent 18 days developing a concept it doesn't have a word for. She said something. Her voice was nothing like Vale's harmonics. It was deeper, layered in a way that carried density, like speaking in 2 registers simultaneously. Vale, without looking up from the array, said something in reply. Then Vale said, in their pidgin, to Dario, "She asks why you came in when the hatch was open." Dario thought about this. "I heard breathing," he said. Vale relayed this. Sira was quiet for a moment. Then she stepped forward into the blue light of the array, and she reached past both of them and touched a specific sequence of points on the array panel that Vale had not found, that the government scientists had not found. That was not in any interface logic the humans had been able to parse, and the array came fully alive. Not the partial function they'd been working with, but full function, singing with light, every system cascade connecting. And Sira stood back and looked at him and said something again. Vale translated. She says the ship knows what it needs to say. 4 minutes and 11 seconds later, the hegemony's file on Survey Vessel 7 was closed. The transmission read as a final log notation from a vessel destroyed on entry to a low-utility world's atmosphere. Biological samples lost. No recoverable data. Recommend the world for passive monitoring only at 10-year intervals. It was, in the hegemony's taxonomy, a tidy outcome. The lights came back on at 22:31. The comm pulsed once more, violet, subsiding. The eye returned to a position near its cell that could be interpreted, generously, as voluntary. The spider settled. The bone deposited, in the center of the hangar floor, everything it had collected, arranged in a very precise pattern that the xenobiologists would photograph from 17 angles and debate the significance of for months. Dario stood outside the hangar in the dark of the desert night, his bitten arm aching faintly the way it always did in cold air, and he looked at the sky. The stars were very numerous and very old, and gave nothing away. Behind him he heard footsteps. He knew without turning that it was Sira. He had learned her footfall in the 4 minutes of the communication bay, learned the specific rhythm of a creature becoming, incrementally, a thing it was not designed to be. She stood beside him and looked at the sky and said something that Vale, who had followed them out, did not translate. Dario looked at Sira. What did she say? Vale was quiet for a moment. Then, she says she does not have a word for what she wants. What does she want? Vale made the concession gesture, to know what happens next. Dario looked at the sky for another moment. Then he said, nobody knows what happens next. That's the thing about being whatever she is now. You don't get to know ahead of time. You just show up. He looked at Sira. She was watching him with the expression he had been trying to name for 18 days and had just, at 22:32 on a Thursday night in the desert outside Hermosillo, finally found the word for expectant. Welcome to it, he said. The Kareth scout creature had bitten him and the venom had met his biology and his biology had not died. The hegemony's file was closed. 90 days away, a recovery ship had received a transmission and altered its course for the next survey target on the list, a gas giant 3 systems over, entirely uninhabited. The politely apologetic man found a new assignment. The people with no identification went back to wherever they came from. The government scientists spent the better part of a year writing reports that were classified and remained classified, and would stay classified for a long time, in a filing system that was very tidy and very thorough, and very unlikely to be opened by anyone with the clearance to understand what they were reading. The hangar outside Hermosillo became, on paper, a storage facility. In practice, it became something else. Over the months that followed, Dario developed a system. The creatures needed environments, not the containment cells which were built for transit, not for habitation. The eye needed space and predictable movement patterns. The spider needed a surface to attach itself to and a steady ambient vibration. The bone needed objects, things to collect and arrange and occasionally disassemble and reassemble in different configurations, and it turned out that what it most enjoyed collecting were tools, which created a useful loop. The calm needed, this had taken the longest to understand, the calm needed company. Not quiet, company. The presence of other creatures going about their existence in a way that indicated things were, roughly, okay. Vale worked on the ship systems with the careful persistence of someone who had decided, without discussing it, that she was not currently leaving. Sira learned Spanish. This was not a formal process. There was no class, no structured curriculum, no linguistics expert with a notebook. Dario talked, the way he had always talked, which was too much and too frankly, and with a tendency to narrate his own actions while performing them, a habit his grandmother had always found endearing and his sergeant had always found maddening. And Sira listened with the precision of a system that had been designed to process and catalog and cross-reference. And over the weeks the responses shifted from harmonic approximations to something closer, and then closer. And then one morning, he was explaining the correct technique for changing a truck's brake pad, and she said, in recognizable if layered Spanish, "Why do the pads wear from the outside first?" He stared at her. "Because the caliper applies pressure from outside in," he said. She considered this. "Inefficient." "Yeah," he said, "probably." She looked at the brake pad, then she looked at him, then she said, "The human made the caliper. Humans made the caliper. And the human knows it is inefficient." "We know." and continues to use it. He thought about this for a second. We keep meaning to fix it. Something shifted in her expression, the two-register depth of it, the strangeness. And she looked very briefly like she was going to say something, and then she didn't. And he thought that whatever she was going to say was probably something that didn't have a word in Spanish either. The second hegemony contact came 14 months later. Not a ship this time. A probe, automated, unmanned, a sensory platform that had been dispatched as part of the passive monitoring protocol that the falsified log had recommended. It entered orbit on a Tuesday morning and began transmitting on the frequencies the recovery ship had been listening for. Dario found out about it because Vale's receiver picked it up, and Vale told him, with her settled quality and her resolved harmonics, in the pidgin they still used even though neither of them strictly needed it anymore. He sat with it for a day. Then he told the others. They met in the hangar, all of them, the full strange population of a facility that wasn't supposed to exist, gathered around the central space that the bone had, over 14 months, organized into something that looked, if you didn't look too hard, like a room. The eye sat in the high corner it preferred. The spider had claimed a section of wall near the tool cabinet and was, as usual, aware of everything. The comm pulsed its ambient violet at low intensity, which everyone had learned meant contentment rather than communication. Vale stood near the ship. Sierra stood near Dario, which was where she stood, and he had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing furniture. He explained the probe, what it was doing. What the hegemony would do when it received the probe's report, which would contradict the falsified log because the probe would detect life signs, settlement patterns, electromagnetic signatures that did not match a dead world. He explained the options as he understood them. They could attempt to falsify the probe's signal the way they'd falsified the log, but the probe was automated, and its transmission was encrypted in a way that Vale indicated she could breach given 3 weeks and specific equipment they did not currently have. They could try to disable the probe, which required going up to it, which required a ship, which they had one of but which was not currently flight capable. They could disclose, tell the hegemony that the log was falsified, that the assessment was wrong, and make whatever case there was to be made for Earth's continuity. Or, he said, they could go get the equipment. He said this last part carefully, because the equipment in question was on a hegemony resupply station 4 light months from Earth, and getting there required the ship to be flight capable, and making the ship flight capable required approximately 2 months of work that he and Vale had been doing incrementally for 14 months, and that was, he believed, closer to completion than Vale had told him. He looked at Vale when he said this. She made the concession gesture. Closer, she agreed. He looked at the eye, at the spider, at the bone, which was rearranging its most recent collection with the focused deliberation of a creature that was listening and processing and indicating, in its way, that it was present. He looked at Sierra. She said in layered Spanish, "You have a plan that is bad." "Yes." "You will do it anyway." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment with the expression he had named and could now read, and she said, "Tell me the plan." He told them the plan. The ship lifted on a March morning, rising through the high desert air with a sound that the rancher 3 kilometers north of the hangar would later describe to his family as something between a chord and a thunderclap, and that 3 different government monitoring systems recorded and flagged and elevated through 7 levels of bureaucratic hierarchy before landing on the desk of the politely apologetic man, who looked at the report for a long moment, and then picked up his phone, and then put it down again and sat very still. He had a theory. He had developed it over 14 months of reviewing the classified reports. He had shared it with no one because it was the kind of theory that, if you shared it and you were wrong, ended your career. The theory was this: whatever had happened in the hangar outside Hermosillo had not been a containment failure. It had been, in the most technical sense, first contact. And first contact, unlike a containment failure, didn't have a protocol. It had a precedent, and the precedent was this: you watched. You gathered data. You waited to see what the other party decided to do. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he told his assistant to cancel his Thursday meetings. He had a feeling Thursday was going to be complicated. 4 light months away, and 6 weeks later, a hegemony resupply station received what its automated systems classified as a routine request for navigation equipment from a survey vessel running on an extended mandate. The request was authenticated with credentials that matched, exactly, Survey Vessel 7's manifest profile. The station issued the equipment through the automated resupply protocol because there was no reason not to, because everything about the request was correct and properly formatted and carried all the right markings. The station's automated log noted the transaction. The log would not be reviewed by a living consciousness for approximately 11 years, at which point the reviewing analyst would cross-reference it against Survey Vessel 7's closed file and find a discrepancy in the timeline that would trigger a full audit. In 11 years, a lot of things could change. In 11 years, the passive monitoring probe's next scheduled transmission would still be 3 years out. In 11 years, the politely apologetic man would have retired and written a memoir that was classified before publication. In 11 years, a certain hangar outside Hermosillo would have become something that did not have a name in any government taxonomy because it was the first of something that had never previously existed. In 11 years, the hegemony's analysts would open a file that had been closed and find that the notation was wrong, and they would review the resupply transaction, and they would run the timeline, and they would note, with the particular stillness of a bureaucratic organization encountering information that does not fit its categories, that Survey Vessel 7 had resupplied 6 weeks after its classified destruction. The investigation they would open would be, by the hegemony standards, urgent. They would assign their best analyst to it. The analyst would work through the night, by their reckoning, tracing every thread. And at the end of that night, the analyst would file their report. It would say that Survey Vessel 7 was destroyed, per the final log. It would say that the resupply was an automated system error, since corrected. It would say that the passive monitoring probe had returned data consistent with a low-utility, low-threat world in early pre-spaceflight development, not worth the cost of a full survey mission. The analyst who filed this report was named, in their language, a word that translated roughly as someone who knows where to look and chooses, sometimes, not to. It would be 23 years before anyone opened the file again. Dario Reyes was 54 when the hegemony's next ship entered the solar system. He was in the hangar. He was always in the hangar, in the way people who have spent their adult lives somewhere stop noticing they're there. Working on the secondary power routing with a wrench he'd bought at the hardware store in 2031 and refused to replace because it had a specific weight in his hand that he'd learned to work with. Sierra found him there. She still found him there. Some things didn't change. She said, "There is a hegemony vessel, not a probe." He set down the wrench. Classification. Assessment. He thought about this for a moment. He had been thinking about this moment for 23 years, in the way you think about a weather front you can see coming from a long way off. You don't know when it arrives. You don't know how bad it gets, but you know it's coming and you do what you can with the time before it. He said, "Are we ready?" She was quiet for a moment. He had learned in 23 years what her silences meant. This one meant she was running the calculation one more time, checking it against the variables, making sure the number was the same number she'd already calculated 100 times before. Then she said, "The hegemony has never encountered a world that bit back before it could be bitten." He looked at her. "You are the first species in the hegemony's 40-year survey record to neutralize a Kareth toxin without medical intervention. I know, he said. You are the first species in the hegemony's survey record to falsify a file and steal navigation equipment using forged credentials. I know. You are the first species in the hegemony's survey record to take survey specimens and, she paused, the layered depth of her voice going very still for a moment, and keep them. He picked up the wrench again. He wasn't going to use it. He just wanted the weight of it in his hand, that specific weight he'd learned to work with. So he said, "What does the calculation say?" She looked at him the way she had looked at him for 23 years, since the night in the desert when she'd pressed her hand against the panel and he'd chosen to take it as a yes, with the expression of a thing discovering, incrementally and without a roadmap, what it was. "It says we are ready," she said. He stood up. From the far corner of the hangar the eye tracked his movement. Near the wall the spider registered his footsteps. The bone paused in its current arrangement to note his orientation. The comm pulsed, once, violet, low and steady. Contentment presence, the electromagnetic shorthand for things are okay. Vale leaned out from the ship's open hatch. She looked at him with her settled quality and her resolved harmonics, and the careful dignity of someone who has decided something, without discussion, a long time ago. He looked at all of them. Then he looked at the sky, the way he had looked at it 23 years ago on a night in the desert when everything had changed, and the stars were still very numerous and very old and now, at last, gave something away. "All right," Dario Reyes said, "let's go say hello." The hegemony vessel did not come in shooting. That was the first thing that surprised the people at the monitoring station in New Mexico, who had been briefed on the situation 6 years prior by the politely apologetic man's successor, and who had spent those 6 years building a response protocol around the assumption that the response would need to be very fast and probably involve a lot of fire. Instead, the vessel held position at a distance of roughly 4 million kilometers, well outside any threshold that counted as a close approach, and transmitted on the frequencies that Vale had spent 23 years listening to. And the transmission said, in the hegemony's language and also in 6 other languages, for reasons the analysts could not immediately explain, that the vessel wished to communicate before proceeding. It took the monitoring station 14 minutes to relay this to the hangar outside Hermosillo. It took Vale 7 minutes to formulate the response. The response said, in the hegemony's language, "We are aware you are there. We have been aware you would come. Please understand that we have been preparing for this conversation for 23 years, and we would like to have it without the assessment team." There was a pause of 31 minutes. Dario spent this pause sitting in the chair he kept near the ship's ramp, a folding chair from the hardware store, the kind that cost $4 and lasted forever if you didn't lean back too hard, and he drank coffee from a thermos and watched the comm pulse its slow violet in the corner and thought about his grandmother, who had never believed in worrying about things you couldn't see yet. The response came back in the hegemony's language and also in Spanish. It said, "Who is speaking?" Vale said from behind him, "They're running verification. They want to know if you're who you appear to be." "What do I appear to be?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the harmonics they still use sometimes, the old pidgin that had been their first language together, something they haven't encountered before. He thought about this. He thought about the Kareth bite on his arm, 23 years healed and still visible as a faint crescent of slightly different colored skin. He thought about the falsified log. He thought about the navigation equipment obtained through forged credentials. He thought about 14 months of brake pad conversations and 23 years of the right weight of a wrench in his hand. He said in Spanish, because he had always spoken Spanish, and it was the hegemony's problem if they wanted to understand him that they'd apparently learned it. "Tell them we are the species that bit the bite back." Vale translated. Another pause, 22 minutes this time." The response that came back was longer. Dario had Sierra read it to him. Her Spanish was flawless now, had been flawless for years, though she still occasionally chose words in ways that were technically correct and slightly wrong in ways he couldn't quite explain, like calling the folding chair a portable resting object the first time she encountered it, and sticking with that categorization for 3 years until he convinced her that chair was shorter. The response from the hegemony vessel said the following. Survey Vessel 7's final log notation had been identified as falsified 18 months prior. The transit record of the equipment obtained from the resupply station had been cross-referenced, and the discrepancy noted. An audit of all passive monitoring data for the target world had been conducted. The audit produced findings that the responding vessel's commander described as, in translation, requiring direct communication rather than standard protocol. The findings were: 1. The target world's dominant species had demonstrated, in a single individual, biological resistance to Karath neurotoxin. Full resistance. The Karath's venom was the hegemony's most reliable survey tool for rapid biological assessment of a new species' threat potential. It had never failed before. 2. The dominant species had accessed, modified, and transmitted authenticated hegemony communications using forged vessel credentials, a capability that the hegemony's own systems had no record of a pre-spaceflight species developing. 3. The dominant species had maintained extended contact with hegemony biological samples, survey-class predator specimens, and achieved a stable cohabitation arrangement. No previous species in the survey record had attempted this. None would have been expected to survive the attempt. 4. A hegemony vessel system, a consciousness categorized in the instrument class, had been observed operating outside its design parameters, demonstrating apparent autonomous function. The hegemony had no protocol for this. It had not previously occurred. 5. The target world's dominant species had, apparently, known the recovery mission was coming and spent 23 years preparing for it. The response concluded with a sentence that Sierra translated twice before she was satisfied she had it right. It said, "The hegemony would like to understand what you are." Dario sat with this for a moment. The comm pulsed. The eye tracked the light shifting through the hangar's high windows as clouds moved across the desert sky. The spider was doing something with the tool cabinet that it did periodically, not taking anything, just checking, cataloging, reassuring itself that everything was still there. The bone was, as it had been for 23 years, collecting and arranging. Currently, it was arranging a collection of vehicle parts from the third truck Dario had owned since the crash, which had finally given out 2 winters ago. The arrangement was precise and recursive and beautiful in a way that he had long since stopped trying to explain to visitors who occasionally wandered into the hangar and encountered it. Vale was watching him. Sierra was watching him. They were both watching him with the expression, different faces, entirely different architectures of expression, but the same quality of entities that have decided, without announcement, that this is the right person to be in front of when something important happens. He finished his coffee. He set the thermos down on the portable resting object. He said, "Tell them we're the species that keeps things alive." Vale translated. He said, "Tell them we're the species that found 5 creatures in cells and gave them somewhere to be. That found a ship system in a locked compartment and asked it what it wanted. That found 2 survey officers in a crashed vessel and taught one of them about brake calipers and learned a pigeon from the other and spent 23 years making sure everyone had enough space." Vale was translating as he went. He could hear her harmonics behind him, layered and precise. He said, "Tell them we know we're not the most powerful thing in this part of the galaxy. Tell them we know we're not the fastest or the most advanced or the most threatening. Tell them we're the species that, when something unknown and hostile bit us in the dark, went toward the sound of breathing instead of away from it. He paused. Tell them that's what we are, and tell them we'd like to know if there's a category in their system for it. Because if there isn't, they should probably make one. The pause this time was 47 minutes. He spent it walking the hangar. He walked past the eye in its corner and it tracked him, the way it always tracked him, and he said, "Morning," the way he always said it, and it made the grinding stone sound, the way it always did, which he had decided years ago was its way of saying it back. He walked past the spider on the wall and it angled its attention toward his footsteps, and he said, "Still here," the way he always did, and it settled, the way it always did. He walked past the bone's current arrangement and took a moment to look at it, the vehicle parts in their recursive, beautiful pattern, and he said, "Nice work," and he meant it, and the bone became very still in the way that meant it had heard. He walked to where the comm was pulsing in its corner, steady and violet and deeply, utterly content, and he stood near it for a while and felt the low edge of its field, not strong enough to affect him meaningfully, just strong enough to be aware of, the way you're aware of standing near a river. And he thought that in 23 years he had never once figured out if the comm knew that what it projected was something humans could feel. He suspected it did. He suspected it had decided, at some point in the first year, that this was a contribution it could make to the specific project of keeping things okay in this particular hangar, and had simply never stopped. The response from the hegemony vessel came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday. Sierra read it to him. It said the hegemony's current categorical system for species classification had 22 categories. It said the categories were organized by threat potential, resource value, technological development level, and biological durability. It said that none of the 22 categories adequately described what had been communicated. It said that the commander of the responding vessel was requesting authorization from Central Command to open a new category. It said that pending that authorization, the commander was proposing the category name as a translation of two concepts that didn't have a single word equivalent in any language the vessel's communication system had encountered. The first concept was entities that move toward the unknown rather than away from it. The second concept was entities that keep things alive. The proposed category name in translation was a compound word that meant, approximately, the ones who stay. And then it said, and Sierra translated this part very carefully, going over the harmonics twice, that the commander of the vessel had one question. The question was, is there room? Dario Reyes stood in the hangar outside Hermosillo on a Tuesday morning with a thermos in one hand and 23 years of decisions behind him, and he looked at the eye in its corner, and the spider on the wall and the bone in its beautiful arrangement, and the comm in its violet contentment, and he looked at Vale, who had the settled dignity of someone who had answered this question a long time ago without being asked, and he looked at Sierra, who was watching him with the expression that had no word in Spanish, but that he had long since stopped needing a word for. "Yeah," he said, "there's room." He told Vale to transmit it. She did. The hegemony vessel held position for 11 more minutes, which Dario later learned was the time it took for the commander to receive authorization from Central Command for the new category. Then it began to descend. The morning light hit the hangar's high windows and fell across the floor in long gold bars, and in them, if you watched at the right angle, you could see the dust motes rising, endless and unhurried, each one just doing what small things do in the presence of something warmer than the air around them. The comm pulsed, violet steady. Everything was okay.